chat box to ask questions throughout the session or to get tech help as needed. We don't have a ton of time for questions throughout, so we'll definitely be monitoring that, and we'll follow up as needed as well. You can also, if you'd like to speak, raise your Zoom hand, or if you're just joining us via audio, you can press *9. And as I mentioned, as we were getting started, please rename yourself and add your organization, your city, or your agency into your title so that we know where you're from, so we can help facilitate the breakout sessions and have a good mix of different organizations in each of those groups. I think you know most of us at this point in time, but here's just a reminder of your Boost team. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm a program manager here at ILG. I'm joined today by Carly Brown, Kim Danko, Nicole Enright, and Hannah Stomakovich from our Boost team. By way of introductions, as you're renaming yourselves, please also go ahead and share in the chat box your name, title, and organization, just to give us a sense of who is joining us today. And please feel free to continue to do that as we jump into our kickoff speakers. So Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you on this Monday. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's call, our peer learning session, is all around climate action planning. So the goal of this call today is to share tips and tools to help fellow Boost communities navigate climate action planning, sometimes with limited resources, in partnership with consultants, and often in service of disadvantaged communities. So we'd love to take the time today to share success stories, share lessons learned, help each other navigate some challenges, and talk through questions. So we hope that you will find some useful nuggets of information from our kickoff speakers and from each other during our breakout sessions. So we're going to kick off with one of our Boost communities today. That we have Adriana Figueroa from the City of Paramount is joining us, and Jeff Catton, the Sustainable Communities Director from Environmental Science Associates. So ESA is the consultant team working together with the City of Paramount to develop the city's first climate action plan. So just before we dive in, I see Adriana on the line. I just want to make sure that you can hear us okay.
Can you hear me, Nicole?
Yeah. Hi, Adriana.
Oh,
welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you for
Yeah, so we just wanted to kick off our conversation today, learning more about Paramount. So can you introduce the climate action and actually the resilience planning that you are working on? And, you know, can you tell us more about why the city wanted to take this on? What are you hoping to achieve? And how are you funding all this work? We'd love to learn more about it.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. I think it's important to note for those on the call that may not know who we are, Paramount is a city that is located in the Southeast LA County area. We're part of the Gateway Cities COG. We incorporated back in 1957, and you know, for the most part, our land use had already been established by the county. And so a quarter of our land use is zoned for industrial purposes. And the city has always had this special consideration to environmental programs. So that's really where it begins. We've always wanted to do that. We felt that it was, you know, sustainability programs have always been critical, but we are a disadvantaged community. We don't have a lot of funding. We don't have the funding that we wish we'd had. And we certainly do not have the resources in terms of staffing levels. And so when you ask, you know, why is the city doing it? You know, again, we've been wanting to implement sustainable activities into our operations for many years. And so the creation of a climate action plan is really, the way we look at it is really an opportunity to create for us a roadmap that we can have for more concrete greenhouse gas emission reductions for the future. In terms of what we plan to achieve, again, we want, we feel that environmental programs are very important, but again, we need this roadmap that can help us guide that and guide future policies. And we'll like to obviously reduce our emissions as much as we can. We would like to have it in line with the state's.
Adriana, are you still there?
Hello?
Hi, Adriana?
Sorry.
Cutting out just a little bit.
Sorry.
I think we might have lost you, Adriana.
Okay. Give me.
You might want to try calling in with a phone as opposed to joining through your computer audio. That might help a little bit.
I'm on the phone right now.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah, it's better now.
You know what happened is I'm
Got it.
in the basement. I'm in the basement right now. Literally in the basement. Coming out of a meeting, and so that I don't get locked out. Yes. Sorry.
No problem.
The difficulties of remote, conferences, right?
No worries.
So anyway, did I answer your question? Did you?
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the funding you were able to pull together for this climate action plan?
Yeah. So
able to leverage some?
And I appreciate that, because you started off by saying, how we're going to talk about how disadvantaged communities are doing this. I will tell you, we would not be doing this had it not been for the Boost program, the partnerships that we have been able to develop, and how we were able to really look for ways and get creative in terms of funding this. Again, shout out to ILG, who helped tremendously with this. The city obviously contributed a little bit, what we could. We basically took it out of our general fund because we feel, we feel very passionate about this. Again, we could not have enough funding for all of it. And so it really took a real partnership through the Boost program, through ILG, to make this happen.
Great. So Adriana, just wanted to reflect, the climate action plan planning process is still in progress. So could you just share a little bit, so far, what has been surprising? What have you learned? What has been hard? What do you think other communities that are just starting this process up or are thinking about it soon, what do you think they should know?
It's interesting. I think what has been surprising is how much work that goes into it. When you think about climate action plan, I don't know, prior to us getting started with the project, just so much that goes into it, so much data collection, so much of staffing that is needed to be engaged. As you know, Nicole, Wendy participates on the calls weekly. It's been really, it's a lot of work. I think that has been the most surprising of it all. In having to do all of that with limited staffing capabilities. But on the other hand, I think what is really important is regardless of who you have, you've got to have someone who is dedicated to that effort. Someone who understands why we want to do this and is just as passionate in doing it. And I think that's key. But yes, in terms of what has been surprising, it's been how much work that goes into it. It's not so easy.
For sure. Well, thanks so much, Adriana. I'd love to turn to Jeff to ask him some questions and hear about, climate action planning and Paramount from their perspective of, ESA. So Jeff, can you share a little bit about us, or a little bit with us about, what's it like in the consultant's role for those of us who don't know what a climate action plan is or a climate action and resilience plan? Why is it important to do one if your city hasn't yet, or why is it important to update one that you might already have?
Sure, and let me start by saying that we have worked with ILG on an overall framework for all the gateway cities called the Gateway Cities CAP framework. That's been really useful here. In fact, the way we've approached this project from the very beginning is we're working within that framework, which is essentially a set of sort of prepackaged templates and data, including the inventory for the city that had already been completed as part of that project, and a sample or a range of greenhouse gas reduction measures, sort of best practices, if you will, that we see in climate action plans that includes a tool for any city can use these tools, but it was geared towards the gateway cities and sort of their local conditions and demographics, but it's really a set of measures that we're building from that sort of pre-exist, if you will. But just sort of back to your question, I think there's a few reasons that cities are doing these or updating them. We, of course, are seeing more climate impacts in the last few years, and boy, are we living through some right now. Where I live in Berkeley, it's just really hot today, and I can barely open the windows because of the smoke. So I get reminded on a daily basis of why we're doing this work, and I think increasingly our communities are as well. And there's a lot of concern how these impacts are disproportionately affecting some groups over others. You mentioned the disadvantaged communities earlier, Adriana, in Paramount, and that's a big driver, I think, here is that how are these climate impacts affecting those who have the least capability or resources to really deal with them, or who are at most risk to these hazards based on where they live or their living conditions. And so there's more interest in equity around climate action planning and how it relates to all the other planning that's going on in a city. And it should be done in a way that benefits everyone. So if a city is going to invest in reducing emissions or preparing for climate change, it should be done in an equitable way, have benefits for everyone, and the costs are shared in an equitable way. So that's a big driver. And then cities can position for funding. As I think most of you know, there's a lot of funding programs that the state is funneling through its cap and trade program towards anything from urban greening to active transportation to transit-oriented development to fire safety. So that if you have a climate action plan in place, I believe, and I think a lot of folks believe, you have a much better chance of getting funding coming your way because you have a plan in place on how to effectively use that funding and measure the results from it. In particular with respect to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And then there's really a third major reason that cities are updating their climate action plans in particular, and it's because of the evolving regulations at the state level around greenhouse gas emissions, in particular, SB 32, which is calling for reduction statewide to be reduced 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that has implications for CEQA since it's a regulation. So we're finding that large CEQA projects are finding it very advantageous in a situation, if the project is occurring in a situation where a city has a climate action plan, and in particular, if that climate action plan can show or is showing how that local community can be consistent with the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals and what programs they have in place and ways of monitoring that over time they have in place to enable that to happen. So if a project can then be consistent with a programmatic approach, a climate action plan, if you will, then that's a much easier way to get through CEQA for greenhouse gas emissions than it is to kind of come up with a threshold on your own for the project and show how the project can meet that and then go through the whole mitigation measure exercise, et cetera. So there's kind of three main things. I would say that just to summarize is the pressure or the development of the attitudes in the community, which can be anywhere from the businesses to the residents to the electeds, for doing more about climate action or climate change, and you know, developing an adaptation strategy around it, and then positioning for funding, as I said, and then CEQA streamlining. So I think those are like the three drivers we're seeing these days.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So last question on the Paramount climate action planning for Adriana and Jeff. Can you talk a bit about the measures that the city is looking to incorporate into the climate action plan to address equity, to address, you know, disproportionate impacts from, you know, things like urban heat island and transportation access? Could you tell us a little bit more about what is going under the measures in Paramount?
I can start that one, Adriana. We are actually right in the middle of doing a vulnerability analysis for the city. So that's really going to inform, you know, where the areas that we need to focus on, whether it's a certain area of the city in terms of demographics or people where they're living exposed to hazards, or it's the type of hazard that is particular to the city, like urban heat islands, for instance, or smoke from regional wildfires. So we're going through a process of developing that. You know, once we have that, we'll be able to really work with the city in identifying specific strategies. And there's a few different frameworks out there that we're relying on. One is the Gateway Cities CAP framework itself, which did a high-level vulnerability analysis and has several tools, mapping tools, and lists of strategies and policies that are appropriate for that kind of planning. It also so happens that ESA has been working with SCAG over the last year and a half to develop a similar framework. And in some ways, it gets more detailed than what's available in the SCAG CAP framework. So we're going to be using really a combination of those resources. And then there's the state adaptation planning guide, which also aligns closely with the SCAG adaptation planning framework. All those have their particular strengths and sort of, you know, ready built tools and resources that are valuable for this process. So, and they all weave equity in as an important component. And then the CAP framework, the Gateway CAP framework itself has a component where you can, it was also developed around an equity, with equity as a very important component. And there is a way to select from those pre-built measures, sort of prioritize them based on your local planning priorities. So if equity, social equity is a planning priority, there's a way to sort of rank that. If greenhouse gas emissions is you know, a top concern, you can use that as a ranking. Whether, you know, if it's public health or local economic development, green jobs, those kinds of things, you can, in a way, you can rank the types of measures that you want to focus on using that method, and we'll use some of that as well. But in the bottom, I guess that at most basic level, we're really using the CAP framework itself and adjusting it to City of Paramount.
Thanks, Jeff. Adriana, are you still on the line? Any last thoughts?
And I agree with Jeff. I think what I would like to say though is, as a disadvantaged community, look for those you know, that framework of objectives that really align with our community and what is doable and what is not. And so really finding that balance, I think it's going to be a really difficult thing moving forward.
Well, thank you so much. I know you have to run back to a meeting, Adriana, so thanks for popping out and joining us. And thanks, Jeff. We hope you're able to continue to stay on the line with us.
Sure.
I'd love to turn it over to Carolyn, who's been working with some of our Boost communities, including East Palo Alto and San Diego. So Carolyn works with Harrison Associates, who is one of our partners in the Boost program. So Carolyn, thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about how the communities you are working with, you know, what are the trends you're seeing in climate action plans related to disadvantaged communities and equity?
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here. So one thing that I'm seeing in especially disadvantaged communities, you're looking at how to sell and integrate this plan with community priorities, which is not always GHG reduction. So we're seeing more cities looking at health policies and programs almost making it a health equity plan that has GHG co-benefits rather than a GHG reduction plan that has health co-benefits. And while obviously climate action plans are here to serve GHG reduction purposes, finding that intersection between what the community really cares about, which is access to clean water and clean air and livable communities and food and sidewalks and infrastructure, is how we're getting the greatest response in our community engagement activities. I've seen that in East Palo Alto. I've seen that in Watsonville, which has done really well on engaging with their community through online survey tools. They have established a community advisory committee that is involved in selecting the policies and strategies of the CAP. A robust stakeholder list is also involved in that. But I think, there's all these new mandates about GHG reduction targets. And what I'm hearing from disadvantaged communities, yes, we're all about, and oftentimes actually disadvantaged communities I find are the most interested in adopting really aggressive reduction targets because they know that climate change impacts them first and worst. Unfortunately, they also have the least resources to meet those targets. So I found the approach that Watsonville took really interesting. They are a really committed group. The staff I'm referring to in terms of, and the community really, in selecting a really aggressive, they wanted the carbon neutrality by 2045. And it's this balancing act of, this is the vision we have for our community, with the acknowledgement that as a disadvantaged community, there are other cities that have more resources and capacity to take the lead on meeting these really aggressive, ambitious reduction targets. So we are going to focus a little bit more on strategies that overall improve the resilience of our community, that being the community gardens, the access to transportation, the community building aspects of a climate action plan, while obviously still having those core GHG reduction strategies. But yeah, I think that summarizes, that integration of health and equity is really the buy-in for some of these communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's a really important takeaway. So you talked a little bit about, engaging with community members to understand priorities and what they want to see in a climate action plan. So especially during COVID, and we've covered this in previous webinars, and I'm sure we will in the future. But what are some of the ways you're seeing community or cities, local agencies engage with communities during this time to really make sure that community priorities are directly informing climate action plans?
Yeah, so I mean, I've worked with City of San Diego, but since so many of them are on the call, I think I'll wait for them to speak to their engagement process. But again, for Watsonville, which has had a tremendous amount of success engaging their population, they did it through COVID. They had online survey that was more interactive, I would say, than most. They're also building a web application that allows the community to better understand the data that's driving the decision-making policies and programs at the city, which I think is really unique. Obviously difficult for a disadvantaged community to come up with the funds to maintain a site like that, but we use a lot of open source, or at least a lot of the software they're using is from the ArcGIS license, which a lot of people have the Esri license to make those surveys and web applications and everything that you can really put out to the community. So I think that there are ways to make, especially attracting youth into the process, making engagement a little bit more interactive, which is possible through virtual engagements. I mean, overall, I'm actually very impressed with the amount of engagement, potentially because we're transitioned to a virtual forum, of how many more people can make it to these meetings. We got over 30 stakeholders at our stakeholder webinar, a little bit difficult to manage in terms of all the breakout rooms. But most impressively, I think, is they established a community advisory committee, which is actually listed in OPR's SB 1000 guidance for environmental justice elements, and they're coordinating with their environmental justice element, which is also a trend we're seeing, especially in disadvantaged communities that want to leverage multiple planning processes. They did their climate adaptation, their vulnerability assessment through their local hazard mitigation plan and incorporated that into their climate action plan and incorporating that. And there's a safety element. So really leveraging the work of one plan to comply with a lot of different requirements. This plan integration strategy is really effective, I think, in disadvantaged communities. But back to the community engagement, yeah, we selected about 15 members of the community to serve on the community advisory committee. And actually the first engagement had nothing to do with the strategies that minimally presented on the data. What it did was ask for feedback on how we're engaging with the community. So we actually got extensive feedback on that first survey. Was it understandable? How did you access it? How did you find it? Who didn't take the survey? And how do we focus on getting those groups? And it was amazing the level of engagement, especially amongst the youth that attended that are on the community advisory committee had such great ideas for doing, chalk art with like a little bit.ly link to take the survey. And it's just like when you give them the opportunity to actually be engaged in the process, it's amazing the kinds of ideas that are actually implementable that gain a lot of traction. So it was really inspiring to see, and I really do recommend reaching out to actual community members to engage in the process and drive the process to get that feedback iteratively rather than just at the end.
I love that. Yeah, there's just so much to talk about and to dive in here. So thank you so much for all of those remarks. Thank you, Jeff and Adriana. And I know that there's a lot of San Diego folks on the call too. So I hope that in our breakout rooms, which are to come next, we can kind of dive in and digest a little bit of what we just heard, expand. We'd love to hear, what is climate action planning like in your community? Or what are you looking forward to? Or how are you incorporating it into other policies if you don't have a climate action plan? So we'll come back. I'm going to propose that we come back after our breakout groups and do some key takeaways and some Q&A. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a discussion. So Melissa, if you wouldn't mind just moving the slide forwards to our breakout groups so we can get those kicked off. Yeah, do you want to read the slide? Go ahead.
I was just going to mention two quick things. One, as Jeff mentioned, we did work with the Gateway Cities COG on a climate action planning framework. And so we're happy to share that link with you all if you're interested in the follow-up email after this session. So you guys can hopefully take some ideas away from that. So keep an eye out for that email. And then just some quick reminders here as we go into our breakout groups. Similar protocols as with the full group discussions. Make sure to mute yourself if you're not speaking to limit the background noise. I don't think our groups are going to be big enough that you'll need to raise your hand, so we can probably just moderate ourselves on this front. And each one of the groups will have an ILG staffer in there to help facilitate the conversation, and we will also be taking notes that we'll share around with you all in that same follow-up email.
Thanks, Melissa. So here's our questions. Hannah will break us out in just a minute. So we have about 15 minutes or so to share with each other not only your reflections on what we just heard, but also, what is your agency's experience with climate planning? What's working? What's hard? Please share. Maybe we can help each other. Or if you aren't working on a climate action plan, how is your agency incorporating climate initiatives into other plans or policies? So we'll take a few minutes to chat with each other. We'll come back and share some key takeaways, something interesting you learned that you think others in the group would want to hear, and then we can take some time for some quick Q&A. So Hannah, I think we're ready for you to break us out.
Great. You're going to see join the breakout group little icon on your screen. Please click on it. You also have an option to leave the breakout group if you're on the phone and it's not connected with your video and you cannot participate. Just come back into the main session and I will reassign you. Okay, with that, I'm going to open all rooms. Please click on join. Okay, so Monica. So I have someone on the phone. The phone number is ending at 6690. Can you hear me?
Now maybe we ended early.
We're the only
I
ones.
noticed it's my group that's back, so maybe a little too early. Oh, there we go.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had good discussions. We were just in the middle of a really awesome conversation around our takeaways across the state around climate action. So thanks for all coming back. Okay, so right now we're gonna do kind of a quick set of key takeaways. Were there any common themes or valuable nuggets of information that you want to share from your breakout group with the rest of the group?
I can go ahead and start. I had folks from El Centro, San Diego, SJCOG, and Lift to Rise, and Jeff from ESA in our group. So it was a great conversation from a lot of different viewpoints. But El Centro is working with SCAG. They have some SCAG funding, but they're also working with Imperial County Transportation Commission for their regional climate action plan. So along the lines of what Jeff was talking about earlier, where it's more of a regional plan that will have, the ability to be done localized a little bit more. San Diego, we didn't have the folks who are actually working on it, but they said they've done a lot of great work with the Climate Equity Index report from their last 2015 climate action plan. And then they're really thinking about, they have this kind of report card that talks about housing and health and different approaches, but it's definitely that holistic report or approach that we were talking about earlier. And Diane from San Joaquin COG was really talking about how they recently completed a climate action and planning and vulnerability study. It was really easy to get the partners on board to see why the research would need to happen. But her real challenge is figuring out where they lie in that, because they're mostly a transportation organization. And conversely with Lift to Rise, who's mostly a collective housing impact organization, really trying to figure out where it all ties together with housing as well. So we had a very interesting conversation, and just a couple of the funding things we talked about was Civic Spark program, utilities, regional funding, and then just you need to cobble together the money because it's not going to come in one big chunk usually.
Thanks, Carly. Anybody else have any key learnings or takeaways you wanted to share?
I can share from my group as well. And I also want to say we got cut off like mid-sentence. So Chandler and Carolyn, I can connect you guys offline so that you can at least finish that piece of the conversation, since we ran out of time there. We had San Diego and Mammoth and Salinas and SJCOG in our group as well. Similar challenges came up that we've heard on other calls around virtual engagement still around climate action planning, and how are you reaching those people when your regular channels aren't available. We were talking about reaching out through places that people are still going, food banks, grocery stores, other community-based organizations and things like that we've talked about before, and using them as a checkpoint on messaging and just a way to reach into those communities of concern that may not be as able to participate in some of the virtual engagement opportunities that we're putting forward.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so I wanted to kind of go to our Q&A and to have a large group discussion. And maybe we can kick this off with Jeff and Carolyn, but I invite the whole group to chime in. So there's a couple key themes that I, have been hearing throughout our conversations around regional collaboration. Jeff talked a lot about the Gateway COG framework, that, a framework is an option regionally. And then, there's also some things that cities could grapple with, how do they address emissions that are outside of their control? I think Paramount, for example, is one of those cities that is grappling with this through their climate action plan. If industry is regulated through CARB, how do they tackle that in their climate action plan if so many of the things that they are able to do, maybe they've been done? So David from Arcata brought that up. But unfortunately he had to jump off, so we'll follow up with him after to share that answer. But Carolyn and Jeff, I just wanted to kind of circle back with you, what are some of the trends you're seeing and hearing regarding the direction of climate action plans, especially thinking about, regional collaboration to pool efforts to tackle those emissions that might be outside of one jurisdiction's control. What are some of the things that you're seeing and hearing? And of course, the full group, please chime in.
I'll just start by saying we have worked with several communities that have large industrial emitters within their boundaries, including Paramount and others like City of Richmond. And there is interest within the cities typically to engage with those sources or those industries, and often it's from a public health perspective or environmental justice angle. It's not so much their greenhouse gas emissions that are of concern, but it's really the air quality and health impacts from those large emitters. Because the state is regulating them through cap and trade, we can be somewhat assured that part of the equation is being taken care of. But the general approach in a climate action plan is to include them in their overall inventory in one view of the inventory, and then kind of carve it out and say, well, the rest of these sources are ones that we actually have some control over, and that's where our climate action plan is going to focus. But let's also include a measure in our climate action plan to engage with these large industrial sources and make sure that the cap and trade funds that all these large emitters are feeding into, that those benefits accrue back to our community. So that's something I know that Gateway Cities was very much focused on. That's why they did, one of the reasons they wanted to do the framework in the first place was to raise the flag and say, we have all these industrial emitters, but we don't feel like we're getting our fair share of cap and trade funds. So we want to make sure that we can set ourselves up for more success on that front.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great point. I mean, I can't speak more to collaboration when, an engagement of stakeholders. I know that the city of Watsonville is an ag community, and agriculture is like front. I mean, it's where people work. It's their cultural identity. Yet they have very little control over whether they can adopt climate smart agricultural practices. So they, through this climate action plan update process, engaged stakeholders early and often, and started working with the county and different ag agencies and organizations to talk about what it would look like to do a county-wide, similar, I think it was Santa Clara did a agriculture plan, a county-wide agriculture plan that include a lot of jurisdictions, and I can try to link to that plan, but yeah, the stakeholder engagement piece is crucial, I think. Also seeing more climate action plans that have some kind of city-county link. I know it's Angels Camp is working with their county to update their climate action plan and leveraging resources between county and city. They're also developing a new wildfire accounting methodology. This is led by Rincon. But to acknowledge the fact that, just like tier 3 emissions, you don't have control over all the emissions in your community that might impact your community most, like wildfire. And how do we deploy and implement strategies that aim to reduce that large emitter of, how do we stop wildfires? That's kind of going into the climate adaptation space, but they're putting it into their climate action plan because that's where they see greenhouse gas emissions on a yearly basis now. So how do we get those goats to get in our communities and control the vegetation a little bit more? So yeah, I mean, I think that having those relationships before you start the climate action planning process with your county and neighboring jurisdictions is so crucial for those, cross-jurisdictional boundary issues.
I love including goats as a measure in your climate action plan. I think we should all do that. So I kind of wanted to transition this to bring this home. What does this mean for the world that we're in today? I mean, we're experiencing so many things that are interconnected that potentially, I think, there's a lot of possibility for us to leverage climate planning to respond to. We have a pandemic, we have wildfires that are going on right now that are devastating, climate emergencies, racial justice demonstrations, housing challenges. I open this to the full group. How can we leverage climate planning to respond to these things?
I just want to say something. Jeff said it in our group, so I just thought it bared reiterating, is that he said, climate is a lot like COVID. We know it's happening, but we just don't really know how, when it's coming and how to deal with it. So I think particularly for some of those smaller disadvantaged communities, we know it's there, but we are trying to get the budget for this year intact. We are trying to address this year's pandemic or wildfire or budget, deficit or staffing issues or strategic planning. And so it's really incumbent on these small jurisdictions to figure out how to balance how long you can put it off until it's at your doorstep. And I think we're finding more and more often that it's at our doorstep now. And while we still need to mitigate, we also need to adapt. And so we're seeing so many more climate action and adaptation plans or climate action and resilience plans because of it, because I think so many of our jurisdictions are saying that it's just not one or the other. We're kind of past mitigation to some extent. We still need to do it, but we need to get on to resilience or we're just not going to literally survive. So I think the wildfire emergencies really puts this in front and center, but the racial justice and I think the air quality, particularly folks, whether it's an industry, whether it's a wildfire, whether it's the traffic causing air pollution. I mean, there's disadvantaged communities that are getting very, very sick and dying, and they're saying that we are not going to stand for this anymore. So we're, working to incorporate those health and social justice issues into climate action planning and really see it as one planning effort.
And I think Carolyn said it well in terms of a lot of times we start thinking about the plan as first and foremost being, for instance, a health equity plan or an air quality plan or whatever it might be, but we need to look for climate benefits wherever we can in any type of planning, because it's going to take it from all sides and all angles to reduce emissions to the level that we need to reduce them. And it's similar for adaptation. There's a lot of preparation we need to do in long-term planning. So I think we need to be keeping climate in mind for every type of planning that we're doing.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a great way to wrap up our discussion. These hours always go by so fast. I don't know about you, but thank you so much, everyone, for your participation and for your discussion. I apologize we couldn't get to more Q&A, but I hope we tried to address some of those through our questions. So I just wanted to turn over to Melissa to wrap us up. Thanks, Melissa.
No, thanks, Nicole. Again, just going to share our contact information here since we weren't able to get to all of the questions. Feel free to follow up with any of us after this call. We will either answer your question directly or get you in contact with the right people to make sure we're responding to those questions. And we've been doing these monthly. As you guys know, I know a number of you have participated in a few of these. We're working through what the next topics are going to be. We're thinking about things around wildfire and equity. Since those are two really big things that are affecting our local government partners right now. But if you have suggestions for other topics, please feel free to share them with us either in the chat box right now or again, follow up with us afterwards. We really appreciate your participation in these conversations and sharing your experiences and your lessons learned. And so with that, I just want to say thank you again to Carolyn and Jeff for joining us and sharing their expertise today, and to all of you for participating and sharing your experiences. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
so much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.